Okay, as promised, this will be a nice short set of notes on the federal court system, and we're going to talk a little about judicial philosophy, which will help tonight's reading make a little more sense to you. All right, the federal court system is three-tiered, as we mentioned in class. At least we did in second period. Okay, starting at the lowest level, you have your district courts. All right, which are spread out throughout the country. Okay, there are 94 of those. Um, Currently, those are created by Congress. Congress can determine how many courts there are. They can determine what types of cases they cover, what jurisdiction they have, etc. All right. Most of these are what are called constitutional courts. Constitutional court is basically what interprets the Constitution. Any amendment violations, criminal laws are all going to basically stem off of that. The others are called legislative courts, which are when Congress passes a law, they then have to create a court to then deal with it. Okay, so you see bankruptcy courts here, for example, since Congress determines the bankruptcy laws, they have to create courts to deal with that. Okay, tax courts, since Congress can tax, they have to create courts to do that as well. Congress runs the District of Columbia. They are responsible for putting a court together to run that. Okay, but most of them are district courts that basically do the day-to-day operations and handle any interpretations of the Constitution. Okay, they also have what is called original, I'm just going to abbreviate here, jurisdiction. They are the first people to hear the case. They do not hear any cases on appeal. Okay, at the U.S. level, they call it the Federal Court of Appeals. Not very creative of a name there. Don't confuse this with appellate courts, which is what we have at the state level. Okay, there are 12 of these. Okay, they hear appeals from federal courts all over the country. Okay, we have a district court in Chicago. We have an appeals court in Chicago. Okay, and then there are a court of appeals for the federal circuit, which is the D.C. Court of Appeals. This hears all cases from federal agencies, such as the Securities Exchange Commission, Federal Communications Commission, etc. In that regard. Now, they only have appellate jurisdiction, so they will hear cases on appeal from the lower courts this way. Okay, so courts of appeals hear it from the district courts down on the bottom. All right, and then obviously the Supreme Court is its own little animal. Okay, we know there are 9 judges, all appointed by the president. That number is again determined by Congress. Okay, they can raise it, they can lower it if they want to. If they lowered it, I don't know how they would get rid of justices. Probably when they retired, they just wouldn't add new ones. When we started out, we had 6 at one point. All right, now we're currently up to 9, and that's kind of an informal amendment to the Constitution. Okay, now you'll notice most of these cases are appealed, all right, through what is called appellate jurisdiction when we submit a writ of certiorari. All right, now technically, a writ of certiorari is a request from the upper court to hear the records from the lower court so they can review it. But what it's kind of turned into as a phrase is where the Supreme Court will take an appeal, the writ of certiorari, from the Court of Appeals or from one of the parties in the Court of Appeals asking the Supreme Court to take their case. All right? They generally grant, this number is pretty much closer to 80. Okay, about 80 out of 1,000 cases are heard annually. Most cases are denied a writ of certiorari for several reasons. If the court denies the request, whatever the lower court ruling is stands. Okay, and then appellate jurisdiction covers anything from those courts of appeals and things. There are a few original jurisdiction cases, as you see here, which is a state versus a state, or the federal government versus a state, or something like that. Anything involving a diplomat, but it's really the state versus a state that you really need to worry about. I mentioned the case in class about the Asian carp permeating Lake Michigan as an example. Okay, so that kind of covers the federal court system. Okay, and we're going to shift gears a little bit here. All right, and we're going to talk also about judicial philosophy. Okay, here's our second one here. All right, we're going to make this big for you. Put the screen up so you're not writing too fast here. Okay, now judges generally have 2 types of philosophies. If you're reading the 9 or Supreme Conflict, they get into this a lot. Some judges are said to practice judicial activism. All right, this has become kind of a bad word in politics, but it's basically usually used to describe more liberal judges. Okay, if you practice judicial activism, you also are a loose constructionist to the Constitution. You tend to support overturning previous cases more easily if they're seen as a wrong. Okay, so if you're an activist, you're going to be more likely to overturn cases. You're more doing something. Think of it like that. Okay. Um, you believe in judicial review as a well-established power. Okay, so you kind of respect the Marbury-Madison decision. Not that the other side doesn't, but it's basically a power that the court has. They're the court of last resort. You'll see Earl Warren's picture here, okay, as the Chief Justice who practiced judicial activism, all right, with his Brown versus Board ruling, Miranda and others. Okay, 14th Amendment, you support that gives the right of the federal government to incorporate various amendments to the Constitution. All right, this basically means that the Bill of Rights applies to the states as well as the federal government. All right, because historically the Bill of Rights has applied only to the federal government, and starting in 1925 they have started incorporating the 14th Amendment, so the states have to follow it as well. More to come on that in the next chapter after finals. Okay, moving down here. All right, judicial activists also believe the idea that the state and local courts has a history of abuses of civil rights, so the federal government should step in. So that's why they would overturn lower court decisions and state laws and federal laws. Okay. They believe that the Constitution is silent on privacy and innocent until proven guilty, so the courts can protect these more broadly. All right, that's where your loose interpretation comes in. There is nothing in the Constitution on a right to privacy, but if you're an activist, you believe that it exists because it's implied. It's an implied right, not mentioned in the Constitution. That is what gave us the case of Roe versus Wade and others. Okay, and furthering down the list here, all right. You believe the Founding Fathers expected leaders to adapt the Constitution. Okay, so that's crucial. It's a living document, and it can change with the times. All right. Activists also believe in the idea that the courts would correct these laws, okay, or state controls over such issues like seizure rights, privacy rights, counsel rights. All right, so we're talking like Fourth Amendment, okay, Sixth Amendment here, that this is a living document, these rights can be applied more broadly. Okay, they're usually seen in a pro-liberal bias. You'll hear about activist judges that generally Democrats want to appoint. No Democrat will ever say that, however. All right. And the final thing here is that the idea that courts might try to change the laws or change the way the federal, state, and local governments try to set up the rules, right, and affect the system. So sometimes you have liberal activist judges, sometimes you have conservatives. All right, you'll notice the court did not practice activism on the healthcare case because the court upheld the existing precedent. They did not overturn the healthcare decision. They allowed it to remain. Okay, even though there was talk of the activists and overturning the law and thus rewriting new policy. All right. So one way that kind of critics of judicial activism pointed out is that they rewrite policy or they rewrite laws when they're being activists, or legislate from the bench is another term that they use. But essentially, they're overturning previous cases and applying a new rule or new law to the case at hand. Okay. Opposite of judicial activism, all right, would be judicial restraint. All right, right here. And this is a more conservative judicial philosophy. All right, they also call these original intent or strict constructionists. Okay, I have William Rehnquist's picture up here. He was the Chief Justice up until 2005, who generally practiced this as much as possible. So if you practice judicial restraint, you will uphold precedent, you will not overturn it. You believe the natural rights of citizens should be, the government should leave it alone. Okay. Article 3 says the court is only there to resolve disputes, that there is no power to make policy there. Okay, so if there's a dispute, you rule on it and you leave it at that. They generally defer to elected bodies to make decisions. Okay, Article 3 does not give the court the right to create policy. So therefore, if there's a policy that's passed by a legislative body, you allow it to continue. All right, unless it's unfair, and then you strike it down and go back to the previously existing law. Strict constructionists or judicial restraint will apply the 9th and 10th Amendments. They will leave the rights to the citizens that are not listed in the Constitution. All right, so that's how a lot of states' rights cases come out of restraint philosophy. Congress is responsible for new policy or creating an amendments. So in the gay marriage case coming up, Scalia and Thomas will probably be practicing their original intent, and their argument is that if we want gay marriage, there should be a constitutional amendment or Congress should pass a law. But it is not their job to overturn that act of Congress because Congress is a democratically elected institution. Okay? They generally side with more states' rights, like in U.S. versus Lopez, where they struck down the Commerce Clause. Okay? Founding Fathers built a government of limits, and these should be followed. All right? Is basically the policy for restraint. So it's hard to come up with cases of judicial restraint only because most cases that make the news and get talked about are more activist cases that overturn an existing case. All right, but we'll talk about these tomorrow in class. Hopefully this makes these make a little more sense to you. Easy way to sum this up: activist judges generally overturn things. Judicial restraint judges generally uphold policy and do not overturn precedent. Right? There's a phrase called stare decisis. That's one of your note card terms, and you will know that it means stand by the previous decision. So when the court makes a decision, you stand by what the previous ruling is. You do not overturn precedent. All right, thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon.